Hello and welcome to Freedom from Trauma, an online education series where we're interviewing experts, teachers, and authors to bring you powerful conversations and profound practices that help heal trauma and consciously create the body, mind, and spirit that you truly desire. Today, it's my absolute honor and joy to introduce to you our special guest, Dr. Veronique Mead. Welcome, Veronique. Thank you so much for being here.
You are so welcome. It's so good to be here, Richa.
You know, I have been using your website, your resources, and have been following you like anything for a long time. And being someone with my share of childhood trauma and the work that you've done and the research and the studies and the information that you have just put out there is just incredible. And thank you for the work you've done and you're continuing to do and for being here. This is kind of one of my dream come true conversations and interviews today. So thank you for making this a reality and for being here and just helping me, helping us, helping all those that are here in this series to learn about how we can actually heal ourselves by understanding the relationship between trauma and illness and how all of this works and how our life's experiences as children have such a big role to play as the illnesses and diseases and all those effects show up in adulthood. So thank you again. And just to start things off, tell us about your journey of coming into this world. Why you chose trauma? Why is that as your field?
Such a good question. I was a family doctor 20 years ago, and I felt as there were a number of things that just didn't feel complete and felt a bit off. And through a long period of really in-depth exploring inside, I ended up leaving medicine, taking a year off. And during that time, I'd been really, really tired. And I thought it was all stress related, which I suspect it was. But I was also, it turned out, at the beginning of developing chronic illness, a disabling chronic illness. It's called chronic fatigue syndrome. Mm-hmm. A lot of people listening will probably be familiar with that. And for me, I was one of those who had a very slow, gradual onset over about 10 years. So I worsened very slowly. So even when I took my year off, it didn't make a difference. I got worse. Decreasing the stress wasn't enough. And I had no idea at that time. So I ended up going back to school and retraining as a somatic psychotherapist. And it was in my coursework that I first started to learn about trauma and in a bigger concept than we learn about as physicians. Right. As physicians, we really think about trauma, or used to, and mostly still do, think about it as related to physical trauma, accidents, and the need for surgery. But I learned about the psychological piece and how trauma is a risk factor for psychological, emotional diagnosis, mental health conditions like PTSD. I mean, I knew that, but I started to learn the details. And the way my program was designed was really about learning about the intelligence of the body and the body's language, and thinking about symptoms as language also. And I got curious about whether trauma was a risk factor for chronic illness, chronic physical illnesses, autoimmune diseases, in a similar way to PTSD. And fast forward 20 years later, I have been just pulling the research together for 20 years because I kept finding the research that shows that there is risk for all kinds of chronic diseases from early trauma in childhood, in babyhood, in prenatal experiences, in birth events. And it's not something we were taught in medical school when I went to school, and it's still really not being taught yet, but there are some early adopters starting to happen. So that's kind of the nutshell of what's taken me here. I ended up being a therapist for a while, specialized training in trauma because of what I learned. And then I specialized also in working with pre and perinatal trauma. I worked with adults, but my chronic illness kept it got worse, and I ended up having to stop working. And so I have been working with my own health from a trauma perspective, which is what you have clearly been doing for a long time too. And I imagine a lot of people speaking here as well. Mm-hmm. And my health didn't sort of start to improve for a while, even though I was doing the trauma work. But I'm doing much better now. Now I blog about the science so that others can really know about this too. Because once you understand that there's a connection and that it's not psychological, it's how life experiences influence our genes and our threat responses and our nervous systems, then we can really look for all the kinds of tools that people are talking about here in this conference, in this summit.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things about trauma, especially when it happens as a child, you don't really know to name it, and your life goes by, and then you find yourself in these patterns, or psychological emotional patterns, and then you find you're physically also being impacted. But that connection doesn't always, it takes some time for that connection to happen. So what's happening there in terms of like, for people watching, how can, we get better at connecting those dots?
I think that's a really important question and process. And I think there's a number of things. One is that in our culture, whether it's here in North America, in India, where you grew up, our cultures are really not aware of or attuned to the concept of trauma, which really is simply about experiences that are overwhelming, too overwhelming for us as individuals to adapt to, which means that all kinds of different experiences will be experienced differently by each one of us. But what is overwhelming for one person may not be for another. And so I think that there's a cultural taboo that we don't talk about things that happen in our family systems. But in between the society and the taboo, there's this sense we grow up in a certain environment in our family systems, and it's all we know at some level. And so the fact that it's all we know can make it seem normal, like this is what life is, and I don't have it as bad as these people I hear about or watch in movies. So how could it be that big a deal? Or I'm okay enough right now. And so there are all these layers, I think, that make it difficult until you start to, often it's people are looking online, they're trying to find some kind of explanation for why they feel so lousy, why the things they try don't work. And for a lot of people, when they start to find these comments about trauma and specific types of trauma, it starts to resonate. And then they start to really look into this more. So I think that's part of it. I imagine that was your experience or part of your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, I know again, from your website and we'll talk about the ACEs also, because that's something that I found so eye-opening, and the validation to be able to name it. Like even having written my own book on recovering from childhood abuse, when my friend suggested the tagline to transform trauma into healing, I said, that's a bit strong, don't you think? I said to her, and her jaw literally, dropped to the ground. And she said, no, what happened was trauma. And it took me a long time, even after having written a book about my experience, to name it. So there is that dissonance and disconnect for sure. And I think when we hear experts, and when we hear someone like you that's done this research and has seen so many cases, to share that information with us, it's very validating. So, the ACEs, can what is it, and how that's serving this work now, and how it's helping individuals like become aware and wake up to just acknowledging their journey?
Yeah, The ACEs, ACE, that stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And this is based on the first research study on it was published in 1998 by an internist, Vincent Felitti, and Dr. Robert Anda, who was at the CDC, who was an epidemiologist. And these two physicians got together and they used a population of folks in the middle class who all had insurance through Kaiser in California at the UC San Diego area. And they had over 17,000 people responded to a questionnaire. And when they analyzed and went through it, what they found was that there were 10 specific types of ACEs, of adverse experiences that this population had experienced. And when they put it all together, they found that it increased their risk of all kinds of symptoms and chronic illnesses in adulthood. So they were adults when they took this. It was retrospective, but there have now been hundreds of these studies in various forms. Some of them look at all 10 ACEs. Some of them look at a few of them. So I thought that we could talk, there's sort of 6 points I might make about ACEs that could be helpful. And the first one is what the 10 ACEs are. And when you talk about them, losing a parent for any reason, whether it's divorce or the parent separating or a parent who's immigrating and is sent back to their own country or who dies, any of those reasons can be really devastating for a child. So even divorce has a much greater impact than we tend to acknowledge in our society. So that's an ACE. And having a parent with a mental illness is a second ACE. And we tend to think, I think, of the big things, having a parent who maybe has to be hospitalized for a very severe mental illness. But a parent who has something like depression or anxiety, that counts as an ACE. And postpartum depression would count as an ACE. And the other ones, there are 3 ACEs for 3 different kinds of abuse: sexual, emotional, or physical abuse. So that's 5 ACEs right there out of the 10. And a lot of folks will have experienced some of these and don't think that they're that big a deal. You know, physical abuse, they didn't include spanking in this, but apparently we are one of the few countries who don't include this. There are 60 other countries that don't do that, and that they've found that that makes a difference in some of the research. So that's 5 ACEs, and then the other 5 include things like having a parent who has substance abuse, whether it's alcohol or something else, who's been in jail, or anyone in the household who's in jail, because often that's connected to other things, whether it's drugs or other substances. And there's also having neglect. And this is a subtle one. This is another one we overlook really easily. So physical or emotional neglect. And that can look as simple as having parents that aren't really nurturing, that aren't really attuning, that don't quite see their child, or that are constantly sort of negating them or telling them negative things about themselves, or that you're not good enough. So those are ACEs as well. And domestic violence between parents is another one. So when we look at these 10 ACEs, the way they worked it out and they looked at the data was that you get 1 point for every ACE that you've experienced, up to a total of 10 points. So the more ACEs you have, they discovered, the more risk increases. And so the risk will increase for things like depression in adulthood, anxiety, bipolar, PTSD, suicidal thinking. And I know from some of the things I've learned from your own history, with history of abuse in your own family and depression, those are absolutely coping mechanisms for things that are overwhelming.
Yes.
And they are not adaptive in the sense of being our ideal of how we'd want. But if that's all we have and we have no support system, or our family members or friends or school, people at school don't get it, we lose that sense of support in our community, and then you're alone. And that's a really common feeling I think people have.
Very much so.
Yeah.
We've been talking about that even in the series, about how trauma causes isolation, and then we sort of sit in that, and then there's no solution, there's no support, there's no healing that comes of it. So the first process is to find connection, even if it's with one person.
Yes. And that's a really critical point, because we're talking about trauma, but your whole conference here is all about how healing is possible. And really, the good news about understanding trauma is that if we recognize that this is what's happened for us, it can really validate and legitimize what's going on. And that childhood way of thinking, where we blame ourselves and we think it's our fault, we realize these are things that happen to us. They're not who we are. And that if those are affecting how our system is being, and therefore creating symptoms in our physiology and how our genes work, that there may be something we can do about it. And that's what I find so exciting to blog about the science, is that people need to recognize that trauma is a risk factor for their symptoms. And once we get there, then it opens up a whole world of tools that we don't think about in medicine yet, but that all these alternative and other approaches, there's a ton of things that help sort of rebalance and return the health of the system. And that's a huge part of what you've done.
Yeah, it's the wake up call. For me, I knew something was off and wrong and not working, but being reflected back, and then it actually by what was showing up in my life, whether it was failed relationships, just ill health, depression, obesity, whatever that manifestation of my pain was a reflection back to me to say that I need to shift something. And I was fortunate enough that I met, that one teacher that helped me, and then one more along my path, which has been now almost 25 years since my first foray into the work. And it's been, without that, I wouldn't be here, because as you were going through that, and I've done this many times to see maybe if there was something I had missed or was something wrong, because I've done that ACE quiz many times, and I'm an 8 on the quiz. And that's not a low number. And my prognosis on that would have been very different. My life could have looked very different if I didn't have these alternative modalities, because I didn't have access to therapy. I didn't have access to, doctors or anybody even validating what had happened.
Like so many people, that's exactly what happens. And an ACE score of 8 is really high. And what they've learned, in these 6 points I'd love to make about the ACEs, one of the second points is that having an ACE score of 2 compared to 0 increases a person's chances of ever being hospitalized for an autoimmune disease by 70%. So type 1 diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, that's an astronomical number. And when you talk about everything you've done, what is so inspiring and encouraging to think about is that we can change that trajectory, even if we already have physical symptoms. And so I didn't mention my own ACE score, and this is point number 3, my own ACE score is really a 0. And the limitation here, point number 3, is that the ACEs only talk about 10 specific types of trauma. And this is what a lot of people are concerned about. It's like, well, what if I was bullied? Or what if I'm a refugee? Or what if I grew up in poverty? There's all kinds of other things. And what the beauty of the ACEs research is that it's becoming known around the world. It's becoming known in medical circles. And it's paving the way for us to recognize that there are all kinds of trauma, and that trauma in general, regardless of the type, can have an impact. and that you can work to heal it.
Yes.
And so for myself, it's much more about the emotional quality of relationship with my parents, who were great folks, who loved me, and who are not the most connecting, nurturing folks. And so that is a really under-recognized risk factor because it affects the development of the nervous system and the immune system. So all this kind of begins to enter these complex lines into our own family systems. And can you talk about it? Often you can't, because the people who are sort of causing these ACEs for the child, the parents, they do that because of their own trauma. And then we can look at how things go back from one generation to the next to the next.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's new research starting to come out in the past year or two showing that a parent's ACEs have an impact on their child's development and health. And again, we keep coming back here to, if parents can work on their own healing and parents can access other resources of connection and friendship or family, then that is protective for them and for their kids, which is another thing that you're really doing with your life as an example. And I don't have kids, but the work I'm doing is helped me crawl out of the chronic fatigue. And I'm not fully out yet, but I'm greatly improved.
Yeah, the thing, I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday who was sharing such valuable information. You know, she had an insight into something, and I said, this is such good advice for parents. And she felt so wrong in having advice for parents because she's not a parent. And I said that to me, as a parent, I so appreciate what you said, because no matter what, even if you don't have children, you had parents. So you know something about parenting. And so never think that you can't share something. She said, oh, that's very freeing. I didn't realize that. I said, yes, you had these insights because you were a child, and we're still healing. You know, we're still, I'm healing my inner child every day, I think, for all the areas that I need to work on. You mentioned refugee, you can feel trauma as a refugee. I remember I think my father was an infant or a baby, maybe 6 months old, when India and Pakistan had their partition. So he was being literally, my grandmother brought him as a baby. He was 6 months old, coming across the border with like the train literally on fire. The train is burning, people are killing each other. There's rape, murder happening on both sides, Hindus and Muslims. And, you know, Pakistanis are trying to get over back to Pakistan. Indians are trying to come, you know, they're trying to cross the border. And, you know, that was, so when you said that, they were refugees for the first several years in India, you know.
Exactly.
And I'm just thinking about the generational ACEs and trauma from there.
And just hearing you say that gives me goosebumps. It's sort of, we all have stories that can feel like just a drop in the pond, and they are so important because the threads really work their way down. And that's kind of where I think the understanding of trauma can change the world, because war has huge impacts that go for generations. And the more we understand all this, the more we can start to change things at all levels, whether it's in how we interact with friends or other countries, so there's just lots and lots of layers that we can make improvements in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So with understanding ACEs, and you also mentioned, you know, babyhood and perinatal, you know, state where there's an impact, like right from that form, you know, from that infant, even before the baby is born. Can you speak about the research on that? Like, how are they finding, how is that being found out that there's an impact?
I kind of build on the term of adverse childhood experiences, and I call these adverse babyhood experiences, or ABEs. There's actually a lot of research, and one example is a body of research called the Fetal Origins of Adult Disease, or the Developmental Origins of Adult Disease, FOAD or DOAD, by David Barker. He was an internist, went to Europe and started evaluating women who were pregnant during the Dutch hunger winter in World War II. And this was a period in Holland where all food sources were cut off because they were held under siege in this particular area. And so they followed women and their babies and tracked, were they in their first 3 months, trimester, second or third trimester during the starvation. And originally, they were really just looking at nutrition. Was starvation a risk factor for later health disease in the next generation? And it was. But what they've come to realize is that if you're under starvation, under siege in a world war, you're also having extreme emotional, psychological stress. So they've recognized that both of those factors have an impact. And what they found, those children, when they became adults, had much more metabolic syndrome. So that's high blood pressure, cholesterol, obesity. And so they started pulling this together, and the next generation, so the grandkids, also have a higher risk. And so what they're recognizing is that these effects go multi-generational. They see it in animals 6 generations later, and we definitely see it in humans. And that's just one body of research, but there's all kinds of other studies that are being done. They found similar results after the World Trade Center collapse on 9/11, women who were pregnant, their cortisol levels, same thing in their babies. So here too, an understanding of trauma can make a difference because these things are outside of our control. And if a mother has a really stressful experience, like your grandmother would have had when she was pregnant and with a 6-month-old, there are things that we can do if we can, here again, begin to find community and safety and recognize how it can interfere with the bond. Having stress and trauma can make it hard for a mother to bond because fear and safety trumps the vulnerable feelings of love. So that's another body of evidence that, and sort of the earlier we are in our development when we're experiencing trauma or it's happening around us, the more it influences our development and our trajectories for long-term health outcomes. And working with these things can make a difference even if you're an adult. So this makes me think of 2 other pieces I want to mention about the ACEs.
Yeah.
Number 4 is really about parental ACEs, and I mentioned that briefly earlier. But so when parents can get support, if medical practitioners, obstetricians, family docs like I used to be, and I delivered babies, if we understood that what we're doing in prenatal care or the interventions we sometimes do for helping moms with birthing, that they can cause problems, we could, if we had to do them, then we could help repair them. And that could help reduce parental ACEs. Because having experiences early in life that decrease the bond makes it harder for a parent to bond as their child grows, and it actually increases the chances for ACEs. So things tend to add up with those. And building in support and repair can also be really helpful to then decrease that same effect. And number 5 is sort of the beauty about all this. We're coming back to treatment, and there's a researcher, Crandall. Her last name is Crandall. She's in Utah. She published her study a year or 2 ago, and she calls these anti-ACEs or counter ACEs. And the study found that if a child has some supportive structure in their life, a schedule in their life, they like school or have a teacher they like, if they have friends, if they're in a neighborhood where there are some good neighbors, these elements of connection and support, very specific individual things can actually counteract the effect of ACEs and be more powerful than the ACEs themselves.
Mm.
And so the not having those can be even more impactful than ACEs. And they're so invisible, we don't think about them. But adding them back in, using community resources like Big Brothers and Big Sisters, or the school counselor, or friends for parents so that they're not alone.
Yes.
All those things can really make a huge difference in the long term.
That's wonderful. I mean, it just gives so much hope that you don't just have to look at everything that was wrong or broken or hurtful, but there was this other stuff that we can appreciate.
Exactly. It's sort of understanding the bad stuff and that it has an impact is just the beginning. Then you can really focus on all the other stuff of what you can do.
Just the beginning. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So you said there were 6 points.
The sixth one is all this stuff. I've summarized all this stuff in an ACE fact sheet. And
Okay.
so it's a one pager on 2 sides. On one page, it has the research and the 10 ACEs and the kinds of effects, whether they're chronic illnesses or other effects of ACEs, and then resources. And then on the back, there's references. And I just wanted to point that out because sometimes it's helpful to have documentation to help educate and inform people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, doctors, family members. Yeah.
Yes, to understand and also wanting to be understood.
Yes, and
And
seen.
and advocating for yourself. That's, I think, something in our system. I know being from India, it was a cultural thing too, just do what you're told, just listen to the doctor, just listen to your parents and teachers. You don't ask questions. That was culturally some of the things that I had to break through and say, I can ask questions. I can, resist this.
Yeah.
But it wasn't ingrained. And I think that some of that is here too. We don't advocate for ourselves with the doctors. And I think it's so important.
And it's so hard because the hierarchy is so well established, and we do tend to think our doctors know everything. And our doctors are actually specialists in a very narrow area of healthcare and healing. And part of the problem is that most doctors don't realize the amount of power they have either. And so there's sort of blind spots from us in the patient role or us as doctors. And this is part of where understanding trauma can begin to help heal, so we can be a team with our doctors, because most people with these chronic symptoms who've been really trying to work it through and figure it out are experts who know more about it than doctors do. Yeah.
So I know you entered into the somatic work after your, start understanding how trauma affects the body and illnesses. And there are so many tools that you recommend. So wanted to ask if you would share some of those tools and practices that that could be helpful, so people can find resources locally or online if there's possibility for that.
The way I think about resources is, when we understand trauma, we start to recognize that this has affected how our nervous system perceives its world, and that it's responding to our environment as if everything is a threat, or a lot of things are a threat. It's caught in a threat response. And so anything that can help begin to shift that trauma-based perception in the nervous system can be helpful. So something like diet, especially from a medical model, we poo-poo that so much. And we think that it's really, I have an autoimmune disease, someone might say, how could diet possibly make a difference? But the things about going very, very clean and reducing everything, for example, that can stimulate inflammation, white sugar, white bread, desserts, pasta, making a really big shift. I did this for 4 years myself. It actually decreases the body's response and need to react to things that can cause inflammation. So it can actually decrease the threat response in the body. And for some people, diet's enough to actually recover from all kinds of different diseases. So if you Google your own chronic illness and look for recovery stories, you will find anecdotes. There aren't research studies, big bodies of research saying if you do this diet, this will work, but there are individuals who have done it. And so that can be really encouraging. And it's sort of what appeals to you. Is it the GAPS diet, the gut and psychology syndrome diet, which is what I did for 2 years? Is it going vegan? Is it going meat only? It's completely different for everyone. But that's an example of a tool. Another tool is mindfulness practices. Mm-hmm. Different from meditation, mindfulness is really about how do I notice what's happening right now without 100% believing my reaction. If I'm having a bit of a freak out or a stress response or feeling angry, it's sort of noticing what your reaction is. So, right now as we're talking, there's a lot of stuff going on in the world and it's pretty stressful. And it can make us more tired or more irritable, or we may snap at people. And that's an example, if we're mindful, we might notice that it's actually a stress response because of what's happening around us. But that it's not actually, if I in this moment am safe, in this moment, in this place, then that's a mindful awareness that can help you be a little bit separated from the emotions that might want to run the show. And anytime we do that, it actually sends a different message to the nervous system and to the brain. And it can help begin to weaken these pathways of threat responses. Mm-hmm. So mindfulness practices all by themselves, you can just walk around during the day and pay attention to what's happening right now in this moment. So there's a whole field of literature, but Jon Kabat-Zinn, mindfulness-based stress reduction is one of the first thing I learned about it. Mm-hmm. MBSR, people can look that up as a place to start. So I have a whole bunch of other things. People in this conference are talking about all types of other approaches. But the other one that I would mention that for me has been the most important, if you have a chronic illness and you've tried everything and you've done all these alternative things and you've done acupuncture and yoga and meditation and you're still sick, it's not your fault. We don't know yet how fully we can improve or decrease symptoms of chronic illness. We know some people can recover, and all we can do is keep chipping away at our own. And so if nothing else has worked, or if you want to really add everything you can, then I think trauma therapy is a way to go. That's been what I've been doing for 20 years myself as a client. Even if I was trained in that also, I kind of worked on both ends. And the trauma therapies I recommend personally from my experience are somatically based. So instead of cognitive behavior where you're talking things through and strategizing, it's difficult you can't access trauma by talking about it. Yeah. So it's the somatically based trauma therapies like somatic experiencing, also known as SE, mm-hmm. sensory motor psychotherapy, EMDR if the person is trained in trauma. So those are just examples. There's the tapping solution, emotional freedom technique. Those are examples that can be really helpful because they're working with the unconscious, whether it's sensation or visual imagery. You mentioned storytelling, someone's talking about that. Mm-hmm. So the trauma therapies, there are a lot of people who have sliding scales because finances are often a problem. And so this doesn't mean, some people are concerned when we talk about trauma that if they're still sick, it means it's their fault and that they haven't done enough. At some level, I think about it that way for myself because I can see all the links to trauma with my flare-ups, with triggers. But how do we consider that possibility without blaming ourselves? Because it might have taken 20 or 30 or 40 years to have these patterns develop into a chronic illness. Mm. We don't really know yet how long the process is or what it is exactly. Let me just click that off. And so we don't know the endpoint, but we can keep working on it. And in a way, as I think you've talked about in some of the things I've listened to, and we've talked briefly, it's a lifelong process. This healing journey is a lifelong process. And it can be hard, but it gets easier.
It's, I've been around this work and now for, like I said, 25 years, but I was never on the psychology side of it or the therapy side of it. It was more on the alternative side of it. And, but in the last 15 years, I've started to understand it both as a client and, I mean, I did study psychology in college, but I never really did anything with it in my career. But like seeing the balance between, like you said, the not just cognitive but going into the body, the somatic experience and how we can release our emotional trauma through the body. We would do, for example, embodiment and movement or exercise with breath and dynamic, whether it was wiggling or shaking or dancing, sometimes drumming, and different experiences that really helped unlock that trauma from the body and actually created the shift. So it's really nice how both ends of the spectrum are kind of, they're actually not ends of the spectrum. I feel like it's just this world of possibilities, which is what we're doing in this series, is to really show that there's many ways. Just if you take pick a way, you'll find a shift.
I agree. And I think sometimes we think of ends of the spectrum because in our culture, mind and body are kept so separate. Psychiatry and medical care are so separate. Psychological and psychotherapy is so separate from alternative medical things. And yet what we really keep finding as we do our own work is how the mind and body interacts. It's all one and it's interacting all the time. And we have mind-body medicine studies, but trauma wasn't really quite incorporated in that. And so sometimes people will think that it's not working or not enough. And when you say, picking something, what I found in my experience as a somatic therapist is we each have what works for us. There's no right answer. There's no one thing that'll work for everyone. And so following what is your own, what draws you, what pulls you, what makes you curious, that's a good enough place to start. What pulls your attention? Maybe it's yoga, maybe it's functional medicine, maybe it's trauma therapy, maybe it's diet, or maybe you incorporate all of those. And so it's really individually based, and that's where I think it's rich, because we can follow what we have passion for and not have to do, we don't have to go slog it through with stuff that we really don't want to do. We can go in different directions. There's so many tools out there.
Yes, I completely agree. We have someone in the series who's talked about EFT, the tapping solution. We have, of course, yoga meditation, but also EMDR, and definitely so many different ways to become aware of just kind of like gauging where we're at, where we even are, so that we can then take the next step to move forward in our healing journey. So, you had mentioned that for our audiences, you had a handout for them. So I just wanted to ask if you wanted to say anything about that, so that they can, we definitely avail of it and learn more about you.
The handout is the ACE fact sheet. I created that to be able to summarize things all in one place. And if people want to figure out what their own ACE score is, they could look at that. The post with the link below where they can download it. I also have links to some blog posts on my blog where they could read about ACEs and chronic illness and learn more or get more information that way.
Yeah, and then also the all the graphics that you have created on your website are really, really helpful. I found them very helpful to kind of get an image of what things are like. It's really
good. Great.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that those work.
No, because I can see you've really put you put so much into that, and really appreciate what you've done. It's I feel like we're at a stage where we're talking more about trauma, and we're having these conversations and bringing it more, making it more okay for people to be open about what their true experiences were, as opposed to shh, don't talk about it, it's taboo. And that was my story, was that it was taboo to talk about it. And I think just connecting and coming out with it and just expressing it even helps to begin the healing journey. So thank you for being someone that is continuing to have those conversations in places where they really needed, and supporting your clients and coming and visiting us here, to bring us this knowledge.
You're so welcome. It's great to be part of this tribe.
Thank
Make it easier for everybody, and just keep spreading permission for everyone, and just keep changing things. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Veronique, for being on this series and being here with us. And as we're wrapping up, I want to ask you one last question, and that is, we're living in a very different time on our planet, a very interesting, tender time, and a lot of us entered this period with pre-existing trauma, and then on top of that, we have what we're dealing with, and so many things. And so what is the message that you have, what wants to be expressed through you for those of us that are facing layered trauma?
I'd say don't lose hope. Keep coming back into your own present moment. We're all actually experiencing some version of this that's going around the world right now. And it may, like trauma can do, it may actually help things shift for the better, including in your own individual life, even if it may mean that there's going through some really difficult times right now. Don't lose hope.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I know we'll be speaking many more times, and this is the first of many. So I really appreciate getting to know you and for you being here. And to everybody watching, thank you for being here as well. And make sure to leave a comment, your feedback. If you have a question for Veronique, please put that down there in the chat below. And don't forget to avail of her incredible gift for us and get that handout from her website. The link is provided as well. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. And Veronique, thank you again. Thank you for being here with us.
Thanks, Richa. Bye.